Good evening, everybody. It's so great to see you all. My name is John Shelton, and I am one of the steering committee members of the Harvey J Speaker Series. And on behalf of the steering committee, I would like to welcome you all to the second talk of the academic year. So thank you so much for being here. This is the Harvey J Speaker Series, and for those of you who don't know who Harvey J is, this series was created to honor my very dear friend Harvey. Harvey and Lorna are usually here at the talks, but they are in a better place tonight. Portugal, they're in a better place. And Harvey would be here if he could be, I know, but they've been planning this trip for a long time. But in case you don't know who Harvey is a true intellectual giant who has published nationally prominent books on everything from British Marxism to Franklin D. Roosevelt and Thomas Paine. And as a faculty member here, he ran a speaker series. It was not called the Harvey J Speaker Series at the time. It was just called the Historical Perspective Speaker Series. But he ran that for over 30 years, brought in an incredible number of highly prominent speakers, everybody from radicals like E.P. Thompson to prominent conservatives like Richard Brookhiser. So the series was created to sort of honor the work that Harvey did over all of these years. In a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker of the night, which is Neil Kraus. But before I do that, I want to turn things over to our Chancellor, Mike Alexander, to give you all a welcome on behalf of UW-Green Bay. Thanks, Mike.
Good evening. It's great to be with you. I will just echo Professor Shelton's words in a few ways. Unfortunately, I had only a brief amount of time to work with Harvey J, and I can feel just from meeting him for the few months that I did prior to his retirement, not only his legacy here, but also how he set us up into the future to be able to have events like tonight. And I can tell you that one of the things that makes me really proud about being in a university like UW-Green Bay, or any university hopefully, is that we can do things where we bring students, faculty, staff, and our community together to share ideas, to do so in an open way, to consider new perspectives, right? And to be able to have conversations afterward that help us understand our world better. And so we're really thrilled to be able to do this and to welcome our speaker tonight. These are really important things in the current time for us to be able to communicate. And so I hope that tonight is going to be a great example of that, of hearing ideas that we can consider and be able to take back with us and think about and talk about and be able to help us better inform how we view the world. So with that, we're thrilled to have you all here. For those of you who are new to UW-Green Bay, welcome. For our students, thank you for coming, and for our faculty and staff, thank you for all that you do and for being here tonight. And with that, I'll turn it back over to John. Enjoy the lecture tonight.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Chancellor Alexander said. We're very appreciative of his support of the series. And at a time in which there's been, I don't need to tell a lot of you, there's been some pretty difficult news about the UW system in the past week. This is what we do. This is what we do well, and we're really proud of it, and this speaker series really honors that. So I'm super proud to be a part of it and to be bringing you this conversation tonight. Let me introduce now our speaker and my good friend, Neil Kraus. Neil is a political science professor at UW River Falls. That's all the way on the other side of the state, for those of you who don't know. And Neil's one of these people that seems to be involved in everything on his campus. He's a department chair, he's pre-law advisor, he's chair of the International Studies program at UW River Falls. He's president of the faculty and staff union there. And he's really a prolific scholar and intellectual, somebody I'm really proud to be friends with. He's written 3 books. The first 2 are entitled Majoritarian Cities, Policymaking and Inequality in Urban Politics. And the second is Race, Neighborhoods, and Community Power, Buffalo Politics, 1934 to 1997. We won't talk about the fact that he's a Buffalo Bills fan, okay, even though I did take him over to Lambeau Field earlier. It didn't sway him. He's still a Buffalo Bills fan, but we won't talk about that. Neil Kraus is also a frequent contributor to a number of local and regional news organizations, and he's authored a number of pieces for regional publications like the Cap Times in Madison and Minnesota Post. But it's his third book, which just came out this month. It's the reason that he's here today. That book is entitled The Fantasy Economy, Neoliberalism, Inequality, and the Education Reform Movement. You know, I got to know Neil because he was working on his first book when I was writing the book that I had come out this year called The Education Myth, How Human Capital Trumps Social Democracy. And the two of us were engaged in regular conversations. I think we talked on the phone for like 2 years before I even met him in person. He's taller than I thought he would be. And we were really both interested in a very similar question, right? Which is, how have the expectations Americans have for what education can do, how has that impacted economic insecurity for working people in this state and in this country? So it's a really, really important question right now in terms of like where we are in education, in obviously higher education, but in the education system more generally in this country. And so Neil's book is profoundly important. All right, you may not agree with everything that he has to say, but I really want you to engage with his argument here because it's profoundly important. What he shows is that the economy that education reformers, all right, tell us exists is, in his words, a fantasy. I'm sorry if you were expecting a sexier fantasy, but this is about the economy here. And what Neil shows us is that how the economy actually works and what we can do as engaged citizens to create the kind of world that actually works for all of us. That's what his book is kind of about. This talk is important for all of us, but for students out there, this book is especially important for you because you need to understand how our economy actually works so that we can together, in my view, all create the kind of economy and the kind of society that we all, and especially young people out there, deserve. So, without further ado, please welcome Neil Kraus.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I just want to thank a few people before I get started. I want to thank the steering committee for the Harvey J. Kaye speaker series. I want to thank them very much for selecting me to speak tonight. And I also wanted to thank Chancellor Mike Alexander and Provost Kate Burns and Dean Ryan Martin as well. I wanted to take a moment and thank John, who you just heard from. As John indicated, he and I have been talking for a number of years, and I remember the first time he called me, I guess it was like 5 or so years ago, and he emailed me first, and he said, you know, I think we should know each other. And, you know, we started to talk on the phone, and as he said, we were really writing kind of similar books about the education system and the political system in the United States over the last several decades, and kind of both looking at the situation that education finds itself in today. I would argue that John's book, The Education Myth, has started a new conversation about the purposes of education. And it reminds us that it's only relatively recently that we've assigned the education system a very, very difficult task, if not impossible task, of providing economic opportunity for all. And, you know, finally, I would say I know of no one who's more committed to public comprehensive education, public comprehensive higher education, or to our students than John Shelton. So I just want to thank him before I get started. As John also mentioned, it's been yet another kind of rough week in the University of Wisconsin system. And it makes me wonder, how did we get here? How did we get to the place in the United States where public higher education around the country is being cut when many states, not just Wisconsin, many states have large budget surpluses now? How is that happening? Why is that happening? I think the story that kind of leads up to the present moment where education is in the situation that it's in really started several decades ago. In the 1950s and the 1960s, a new theory emerged in economics, human capital theory. Human capital theory began to sort of argue that people's incomes should be associated with their education, right? And human capital theory was used to explain inequality as early as the 1950s and 1960s. So we have the origins of what we see today really as far back as that. But then in the 1970s, things really changed. The economy was not good. I mean, I grew up in the 1970s and the 1980s, and I remember high unemployment and high inflation. And I remember, presidential elections coming down to the unemployment rate. Did it go up or down? Those kinds of things. And what business leaders and policymakers responded to a changing economy with was a more or less a new political economy, a different version of capitalism that has come to be known as neoliberalism. And in neoliberalism, several policies, several practices would become commonplace. Things that today we tend not to question, but in the 70s and 80s were kind of new. A constant assault on organized labor, an ongoing, continuous assault on organized labor. The shipment of jobs overseas, the deindustrialization of the country. A whole bunch of public policies followed as well. Opposition to taxation, an emphasis on deregulation, an emphasis on rolling back the social welfare state, a new emphasis on allowing firms to buy other firms, and so they became bigger and bigger, and more sectors were effectively becoming monopolized. This sort of new approach, this new system was really crystallized and made very apparent with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 and his administration. Reagan was very explicit. Government was the enemy, and free markets were the solution to our economic problems. If we just got government out of the way, and this is what Reagan said over and over and over again, and let free markets work, then unemployment would go down, and poverty would somehow magically go away, and incomes would go up, and all the rest of it. One of the other policies that became really commonplace starting in the 80s and 90s, and we're seeing this, of course, today, is austerity, the intentional reduction in spending on public services. That sort of became the default starting in the 80s and 90s. So the schools, in the case of the K-12 schools initially, were constantly under budgetary pressures as a result of this new system. Now, this was not a popular agenda. This was not a winning agenda. You could not go to Wisconsin or to Pennsylvania or to Michigan or to my home state, upstate New York, and sell this new agenda. You could not say, we're going to go after unions to the point where there are almost none left. We're going to fight minimum wage increases to the point where they're not even going to come for a vote, let alone be voted down. We're going to ship your jobs overseas. That's not a winning message. That's a losing message. And so what business and policymakers really did was say, okay, we're going to now talk about the education system. And the whole debate shifted it shifted from, rather, all the things I mentioned a minute ago, jobs being shipped overseas and the assault on unions and so on and so forth, to let's talk about the schools. The schools were the problem. It was the education system that was the cause of economic dislocations, of poverty, of unemployment, of all the economic problems we faced. Now, this message, and I was in middle school and high school in the 1980s. This message was everywhere. It was absolutely everywhere. This is before the internet, so it was everywhere else. Broadcast news, it was on national news shows, it was just everywhere. The schools were failing. That was the problem. There were several major reports written by the Reagan administration. A Nation at Risk in 1983. It's gotten, I think, the most attention. Another report, Workforce 2000, published in 1987 by the Hudson Institute, I would argue is just as significant, if not more so, than A Nation at Risk. And there was a lot of funded research at major universities. The Reagan administration directed a lot of funds to major universities to essentially put out the message that the real problem that the nation faced were failing schools. There was a skills gap, right? There was a permanent skills gap. The skills of the workers were just not keeping up with the new jobs in the economy. But in reality, the problem is that most jobs in the economy in the 1980s, just like today, by the way, most jobs are low education, low skill, and unfortunately low wage jobs. Significant majority, actually. And so what I argue, and this is really what the book is all about, is that business and policymakers and think tanks and consultants essentially made up a mythical version of the economy that I call the fantasy economy. And I define that as the misleading account of the economy and the education system rooted in the economic self-interests of corporations and the wealthy. The fantasy economy is, first and foremost, a political campaign. It's a political campaign that's still going on. And it's a comprehensive political campaign. And there's two tenets. There's two main assumptions or claims. The education system is always failing, and the workforce is always inadequate. It doesn't matter the educational attainment rates of the population or the unemployment rate or anything in the macroeconomy doesn't seem to matter. The education system is always inadequate, and the skills of the workforce are never enough, never sufficient. We were told that we entered a knowledge economy, right? Previously, it was the information age, and that term was sort of supplanted by this notion of a knowledge economy, that there were all these high-skill, high-education, high-wage jobs, and the real problem was the education system wasn't preparing our students for all those jobs. But the problem was, and the problem remains, the knowledge economy never came. Most new jobs and most total jobs, even today, are low education, low skill, and low wage, mainly because of the assault on organized labor and a minimum wage that really hasn't moved much in a very long time. But the knowledge economy myth, the fantasy economy campaign, has been extraordinarily successful, extraordinarily successful. The K-12 schools basically were remade in the 1990s and 2000s. Charters, vouchers, test-based accountability with No Child Left Behind. Always advocated in terms of failing schools and this notion that there was a knowledge economy, that there are all these jobs out there that the schools are not preparing our students for. This is a message that, as John talks about so well in his book, was embraced by Republicans and Democrats, presidents, governors. This bipartisan message for the most part, business and the media. And it was targeted at education itself. This is one of the reasons it's very difficult, I think, to have some of these conversations within education. I mean, I talk about my arguments with people in the outside world, as I like to say, and they pick up on them really quickly. They understand what I'm saying. In education, I think we're still hesitant to sort of let go of the idea that we can't fix the economy. We can't fix poverty. We can't give everybody opportunity necessarily. As the 1990s and 2000s went on, income inequality grew significantly. A large majority of the population saw their wages stagnate, and these trends were used to further the fantasy economy campaign, to further the notion that, see, the schools are at fault. Now, Americans understood, though, and this is important, Americans understood that education was their main shot at economic opportunity. Because Americans, we all live in the real economy. We know the jobs that are out there. And so what happened starting in the 90s and the 2000s and 2010s? Educational attainment levels, the number of people who got high school degrees, associates, bachelors, advanced degrees especially, rose and rose and rose. And it's at an all-time high today. Educational attainment is at an all-time high. But the problem was that many highly educated people weren't benefiting economically from their education. Underemployment became common. Underemployment meaning individuals working in jobs that typically require less formal education than they have. But also, low wages for many who were working in jobs that actually required their degrees became more and more common. So we fast forward a little bit to the Great Recession. Then the crisis, the education crisis, became about us, about higher education. Up until that time, it was primarily focused on the failings of the K-12 schools. But in the last 12 or so years, we've heard over and over and over, and we in higher ed hear this, I think, more than anybody else, that higher education is failing, that our graduates always lack the right skills, that the labor force is always inadequate. This message is everywhere today, in my opinion. It's like the failing K-12 schools in the 1980s, except for now it's higher education. Higher education is structurally weak because of the strength of the fantasy economy, because of the strength of these myths that we live in a knowledge economy. The narrative that we hear continually today, the public has lost confidence in higher education. If I hear that again, if I hear another foundation-funded podcast or news report or another poll, another opinion piece or news piece, doesn't matter. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. No kidding. No kidding, the public has lost confidence in higher education. Effectively, we promise graduates middle-class stability and upward mobility if they get a college degree. Effectively, society promises them that. But higher education can't control the jobs that exist, it can't control wage levels, and it can't control student debt levels. Today, roughly 60% of all jobs typically require a high school degree or less. That's according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. For the last several decades, roughly 1/3 of all bachelor's degree holders have been underemployed. That number is very constant over time. That's according to the New York branch of the Federal Reserve. It varies almost not at all since 1990 when they started keeping track of this data. Roughly 1/3. And then again, as I mentioned a minute ago, many individuals working in jobs requiring college degrees are paid low wages. And we're blamed for those things. Higher education is blamed for those things. These are structural realities. This is the labor market. This is the economy. They're not the fault of higher ed. They're not the fault of our graduates. And yet that's where the discussion is. We need to fix higher ed. Of course, on average, higher education leads to higher income. Of course. I don't dispute that at all. That if you have a college degree, on average, you make more than if you have a high school degree, if you have a master's degree, then, all that stuff is true. But you can't create more jobs or better jobs or higher wages or economic security or social mobility or less student debt by giving more people college degrees. You just can't do that. That's not how things work. You can't create more jobs or higher wages or economic security or social mobility or less debt for engineering or political science or English or biology or communications or sociology or theater or art or chemistry majors by cranking out more of them. That's not how things work. You cannot alleviate poverty by sending all low-income students to college. I spent 20-some years studying cities. I studied urban poverty quite a bit, including urban schools. Of course I support sending all low-income students to college. Of course, that's a given. I support that 1,000%. But the jobs are the jobs. If we give everyone a college degree, if we give everyone a master's degree, That's not going to change the fact that the economy has warehouses and retail and food services and home health care, and those are the jobs that dominate the economy. That's not going to change that at all. It can't. It can't change it. It can't change it. The many factors that directly and indirectly affect jobs and wages are not controlled by education. They're controlled by employers and policymakers. The biggest manifestation of our weakness today in higher education is the austerity that's just reflexive. And we see this right now in Wisconsin. But I want to be clear, austerity is a decades-long policy. It's the gradual, intentional privatization of public higher education. Over 70% of students in this country who are enrolled in college are enrolled in public institutions. Community college, regional, comprehensives, flagships. Over 70%. Austerity has made higher education tuition dependent, something we just take as a given today. Public higher education is much more expensive today than it was. 40 and 50 years ago, public higher education in the United States was very inexpensive. Community college in many states was almost free. The educational consulting industry depends on austerity, though. They depend on a tuition-dependent system, enrollment management, all these kinds of things. We're constantly incentivized to recruit students because we have to, because of austerity, because the state has gradually scaled back what it contributes. And this is something that has happened across the United States. I want to be clear. This is not something unique to Wisconsin or any other state. Maybe it's happened a little bit more in some states than others. Education reformers, foundations, corporations, think tanks, consultants, they want to keep the focus on higher education, and I understand that. That's just smart, because then it keeps the focus away from neoliberalism and an economy that has worked very, very well for a very small number of people. So it's so pervasive, and it's very, very smart. So no matter what the discussion is, it seems to me, in the mainstream, when inequality and stagnant wages are raised, inevitably the discussion goes back to the education system. Inevitably. So where are we now? And where do we go from here? Well, the K-12 system has largely been remade. Standardized tests. I mean, you don't have to defend standardized testing anymore. No one really supports it. Not teachers, not students, not parents. It's done nothing whatsoever to mitigate inequality. It's done nothing whatsoever to reverse decades of inequality. Nothing whatsoever. But you don't have to defend standardized testing anymore. It's just how things work. I've talked to a lot of principals and teachers over the years, and it's just a necessary evil is the kind of language they use about standardized tests. Charters and vouchers, tons and tons of studies. At best, they're mixed. At best. But if you spend a lot of time reading those studies, funded by advocates of charters and vouchers, most of them are, always come back to, well, let's find one thing that works and then let's replicate it. Because the emphasis always has to be on the schools as the source of economic opportunity. Always. So charter school studies can have, all these different, bad indicators of performance in charter schools. And funded researchers will come back to, well, but wait, this is what works. This is what we need to do elsewhere. It's always got to be about the schools. And it's always couched in terms of providing low-income kids opportunity. hasn't done that. Hasn't done that. Charters and vouchers and test-based accountability haven't done those things. Higher ed is being remade as we speak. You can't even keep track. I mean, every day there's another story, a bunch of stories about schools around the country. Oh, we're going to get rid of liberal arts majors. We're going to get rid of majors that are not in STEM fields. We're going to focus on STEM. Very small percentage of the labor market, very small. And yet, here we are, inequality is still growing, and most people are experiencing stagnant wages, and educational attainment rates are at an all-time high. I mean, I think what we have to do really is revisit neoliberalism. We have to reframe economic opportunity and security and mobility. Jobs and wage levels and student debt levels cannot be controlled by the education system. They're the responsibility of employers and policymakers, and yet education is punished for labor market outcomes well beyond our control, well beyond. And I think part of this process is having to reclaim the many purposes of education. This includes, and John and I have had this conversation, quite a few times, to just acknowledge the inherent limits of what education can do and what it can't do, right? Education is supposed to be about cultivating informed citizens in a democracy, providing meaning and purpose in life, learning about the social and natural world to grow as humans. Part of this has to include, when we look at neoliberalism and the negative effects it's had on so many workers, we have to treat all workers with dignity and all work. The benefits of growth should be shared much more equitably. Policies should facilitate the right to collective bargaining. The minimum wage should be increased with inflation, without question. There's lots of other public policies too, and there's all kinds of researchers and analysts have done great work on how to mitigate inequality. We know how to do it. We know how to do it. Using antitrust to break up large corporations is something that seems to be gaining more steam right now, is another example. And I think the future of democracy is really tied to this whole debate. If education is still assigned the task of providing economic opportunity solely, we're not going to look at other institutions or policies. We're going to put it all in the education system. We know what will happen. Inequality will grow. Education will continue to be eroded. Why? Well, it's very easy to understand why. Because it's easy to mobilize indifference or opposition to education when it's being held responsible for something that it can't do, that it can't reverse. It can't give jobs, it can't create high-paying jobs. And as long as inequality continues to grow, democracy will become even more unstable. And it's pretty unstable right now. And so I think that reclaiming the many purposes of education and really taking a look at all the particulars of neoliberalism are central, are absolutely central to preserving American democracy going forward. Thank you.
We have plenty of time for questions. If people have them, I'll bring the mic up to you.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm Mike Archeropoulos, community member. You say that the way that we need to reverse or push back against the reframing of education or the attack on education from the angle of blaming it for economic inequality and for putting the burden of economic development and growth or reduction in inequality on to education is to rethink neoliberalism.
Yeah.
And maybe this is a question that's a little too big and like a little beyond the scope of this talk, but and maybe this is a little, I don't know, a little too meta and up there, but by what means are we to push back against neoliberalism? Because I don't mean to sound like pessimistic or, defeatist, but we don't control the means by which this conversation is happening in the wider public. And we don't control the way that people talk about education. We don't control the way that people conceive of the problems. And we can talk with our with the people around us. But there's a limited effect to that, and we can talk within our social groups or within our sorry if this is going on too long, but
No, so how do we begin to do it? It's quite a formidable task, what I've suggested. Well, I think a number of things as you're asking that question. So much of the what I call the fantasy economy campaign took place targeting higher ed. I mean, much of the research that the Reagan administration funded, and still supporters of charters and vouchers and stuff like that, this is all happening in education, most of it, in education schools. So part of what I think should happen, if this larger conversation is going to happen, is that education needs to take a real hard look at itself and start to think about, wait a minute now, what's going on? Why are we blamed for all these things when we don't control them? But the Reagan folks and education reformers and foundations are very, very smart. I mean, they funded and they continue to fund research within ed schools, right? Teach the people who teach future teachers that, that there's this knowledge economy and the schools are failing and all the rest of it. And everything's about technology, too. Everything's always about technology. That's a big theme of the book. So a lot of it, I think, could happen. Maybe I'm, naively optimistic. It could happen within higher education itself. We could start talking about what we're doing quite differently. Quite differently. I mean, it seems to me that again, the disconnect is striking. When I talk to people who work in other fields, they seem to understand my logic pretty easily. Oh yeah, I guess there aren't a lot of really good jobs. It's not like a stretch for folks, and people have different ideologies, jobs. So I think some of it could come from within education itself. I think leaders have to lead. I think, elected officials and other leaders. I mean, how have the last 40 years worked out? I think there's a significant reinterpretation happening of the Reagan administration. A whole bunch of books written by, nonfiction authors and journalists about how has neoliberalism gone? How has it worked out? For most of us, well, not all that well. In other words, those kinds of conversations could come from different places, not just education. But I mean, those are just a few thoughts. I think it's a great question. I'm not, on one hand, I agree with the assumption I think you're making, and that is that, hey, this is a really tough road. On the other hand, John and I talk often about, hey, maybe there's a significant change happening right now. Maybe, if we want to call it a paradigm shift or a paradigm change, I'm not quite clear, but a lot of the stuff I laid out here and in the book, it's at least questioned now that education can solve everything, at least in some circles. You know what I mean? some mainstream circles. But those are a few thoughts on it. I think it's a good question, though.
Well, firstly, thank you. I'd like to ask, I would say that the point of this speech would be to spread awareness of the issue of education being blamed. Is that correct? Am I?
I think that's fair to say. That's certainly a significant part of it. Yeah.
Would you also perhaps say that this is an issue of the economy and education systems not working together? Because the labor forces have to cater or have to create their jobs so they have people who can work. But so the people who are available to work are people who can't afford the education. Mm-hmm. So then it becomes a cycle and ends up being very systemic. So if you break that cycle, that breaks the economy, which breaks the education system, which breaks the people. So I don't know if the point of the speech is to give a solution, but do you have one in mind that wouldn't cause financial downfall, education downfall? It's okay if you don't, but.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the point of what I'm saying and the point of the book is that, you know, much of the conventional wisdom that we've been hearing in education and in mainstream debate in the last 30, 40 years is at best misleading and in some cases just flat out false about the economy, the nature of the economy, the nature of, you know, the education system being, you know, always being inadequate and so forth. You know, so I'm not, you know, suggesting that. I think one of the things you said was, you know, if people stop working, is that kind of what you're getting at? If people stop working, then that would break the economy, and then that would hurt the school system, the education system?
Yeah, I was getting at the point that it's they're all connected, and if there is no cooperation between economy and education, they're fighting against each other.
Sure. No, I mean, I think that there should be, you know, cooperation. I don't think that the two should be completely separate. But I think cooperation should be based on, you know, what education can do, what it can't do. I think, you know, I'm not suggesting that we, you know, divorce the two entirely. But the economy, I mean, this is the funny thing. I mean, for the fact that we've heard nothing that there's a skills gap for the last 40 years, boy, the economy's done quite well. The stock market has done extraordinarily well, right? We've had I mean, what if the skills of the workers actually were good enough? What would the economy be like in the United States? I think the skills of the workers are more than adequate. And most researchers who look at the data objectively, that's not coming from vested interests, have said that for decades. Everybody has a right to represent their interests. I want to make that clear. This is America, right? We have a First Amendment. Everybody has a right to represent their interests. I think the education system should represent the interests of students who become graduates, most of whom become employees. I think the education system should represent the interests of the education system and of the public that needs an educated citizenry. Business can represent the interests of business, labor can, everybody, I mean, this is our interest group society, right? And I'm not suggesting we totally separate the two. But I think, you know, part of the, well, as I said, you know, the fantasy economy is a political campaign, should be understood as such. Education politics should be seen as political, just like environmental policy is political, just like healthcare is political, just like any other kind of policy is political. And I don't say that pejoratively. I say that just that that means things could be otherwise if something is political. So.
Sorry, you got to deal with a physicist now.
So there seems to be good evidence that at some level, especially in developing countries, there is an increase in per capita GNP, per capita GDP with education level. It's a pretty strong correlation. Like more schooling a society has, the better its economy does for every individual person. Does that that might saturate, and Western Europe might be saturating here. It might be saturating in Canada when you get enough people with bachelor's degrees. I think the population right now is about 30 or 40% of Americans have bachelor's degrees, and I think
more than 40-something, yeah.
And you said about 40% of jobs need a bachelor's degree. Yeah. So it seems like maybe we just don't need more education here, or maybe there are diminishing marginal returns on increasing the education level. But I wanted to ask for your insight. You seem to say that, I think as you started off saying, an education system can't make the economy better just by educating more people. On some level, it seems like it can for developing countries.
Okay.
And maybe we've reached this point of diminishing marginal returns. Is there some kind of rollover in returns to education, or what do you think about that?
No, I mean that's a good question. I honestly I don't know much about developing nations, but I think what you're saying is accurate in terms of what happens in many places when more people going from a society where there's virtually no education, right, to one that establishes a school system, and then 40, 50 years later. I think that the thing I always come back to is, because I've looked at decades of jobs numbers. And, it's funny, 40 years ago, when education reformers would talk about the most numerous jobs in the country, there are only 2 in the top, 10 that required any education beyond high school: managers and registered nurses. That's still the same today. And the other 8 are almost identical, except warehouses have supplanted something. But it's connected to retail, so it's really not different, I mean, I think, I talk about this near the end of the book, what is the nature of the economy? And I think to address that, we have to look at, what is the nature of the world that we live in? And in the United States, the economy largely is it's a consumer-driven economy, and most of what we buy is stuff or objects. And that doesn't seem to be possible to change. When you go back and read the futurists from 50 years ago, they seem to talk as if we could get beyond the physical world. We could, everything's about data and information now. Like, we all remember the pandemic, right? Delivering objects to doors every day. The economy is made up of stuff. And most of the stuff isn't made in this country anymore. So I guess that's kind of how I look at it. Like, until or unless the nature of economic activity and employment became fundamentally different, I guess you're onto something there, that maybe there are, in the aggregate, diminishing returns for, say, greater educational attainment. I mean, I think that certainly seems plausible to me in terms of the overall economy.
Anybody else? Yep.
Okay, is there a specific change you hope to see in the future for the education system?
Is there a specific change? I want the comprehensives in the UW system to remain comprehensive. I want the comprehensives to remain what they were named as, having a comprehensive array of programs for students to be able to, all over the state, access a sociology major, an English major, a biology major, without having to go to UW-Madison or a large university. And I want to have that be the case in all 50 states. And you might say, well, that's just self-interest. Well, the reality is the labor market is no more specialized today than it has ever been. There's not There absolutely is not an abundance of STEM jobs or technical jobs. There appears to be just as many jobs for English majors and political science majors and communications majors and other, roughly, except for what's the difference today? Well, many folks working in those jobs make less than they did 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. Not that there aren't jobs for sociology majors, not that there aren't jobs for, physics majors. And by the way, what is a job for a physics major? Physics majors and sociology majors go sell life insurance, and they are realtors, and they work in banking and all the rest of it. I want us to get away from that myth that's promulgated all the time, that each degree program is aligned with a very specific and limited set of jobs. We all know that that's not how the world works, and yet the folks driving the education reform movement seem to think it is, right? We all know people that go on to law school or business school who studied English or studied sociology or studied history or studied something very different. But yeah, I think my immediate concern is with the UW system. And what I see happening here in the UW system, I see austerity that's just reflexive at a time when the state has the biggest surplus in history. And the only rationale for austerity seems to be austerity itself. Seems to be, it's just how it is now. You just got to get over it, right? If this is the approach that we take now with a huge budget surplus, the economy is cyclical. There will be another recession. Unemployment will be 6 or 7 or 8% at some point. If we don't take a stand against austerity now, you know what happens then? It's not going to be good. It's not, it's easy. This would be easy for us to do now, right? To preserve what we have here. I grew up in upstate New York, and we always looked at, I was a graduate of the State University of New York system. But in the Northeast, we always looked at the schools in the Midwest, in the Big Ten, the University of Wisconsin system, Minnesota, Iowa, and so forth, with high regard. The public university systems in the Midwest are always held in such high regard, where I'm from. And so it's extremely discouraging to hear how we talk about austerity, to hear shifting numbers about what are being called structural deficits on our campus, on all of our campuses. Ask some questions about what is the number? Sometimes the numbers seem to be different. They're different than they were this summer for many of the campuses. It's extremely concerning. So, yeah.
Okay. We got time for maybe 1-2 more questions, depending on time.
So one of the things that you talked about is like some other alternative things from education.
Yeah.
What do you think some of those things are? Because like for example, like the labor movement in America, kind of taking a resurgence back. Like what are some of those other like viable options, or is it like a political change that needs to happen, like at a structural level?
Well, certainly, unions are I think the primary alternative in terms of being able to enable people to have a decent standard of living, right? In the 1950s and 60s, when unionization rates were much higher, you could live a very solid middle-class life with a high school degree, very solid middle-class life. And you could retire at a reasonable age, and you could take a vacation, you could save, you could send your kids to college with a high school degree, largely because of labor unions, right? That's very tough to do today with a high school degree, very tough. So in terms of economic opportunity, unions are the most obvious, I think, candidate. And I think I think a lot of policies directly. Austerity causes greater student debt, which is a huge burden on not just young people, but middle-aged and sometimes elderly people. if you incur a lot of student debt and it takes you decades to repay it, and that prevents you from doing all kinds of things, right? Funding public higher education would substantially alleviate that, given the fact that over 70% of students attend public institutions. And I think there's a whole bunch of other policies and practices which can improve people's wages as well. But I mean, those are a couple of things that come to mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
One more. Yeah. Okay.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I find everything you're saying highly persuasive, and so this is a question just meant to kind of engage your argument and ask you to go a little bit more deeply into it. So I'm a historian of women and gender, and a lot of what I'm wondering, I mean, we know that the labor market is highly gender segregated.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking in these really gender neutral terms about graduates and jobs, when you're talking about, and I wish we had robust unions, right, that protected a fantastic minimum wage, but that period of time when a person could get a job and send his kids to school is really about a male worker.
Yeah.
So what's happened is we've lost, deindustrialization was the loss of male workers and that kind of, that hold that they had on the economy. And I lament that. That's not to say I think that's a good thing. But what we've seen in terms of the higher educational attainment since, say, the 1970s is the influx of women into colleges. And when we think about the relationship between colleges and the ability to kind of economic mobility after graduation, it's much more highly correlated with women than it is with men. In part because, you know, when you're a young woman, you're going to have a hard time going into the trades, right? You can do it. There are young women who are breaking barriers. They're becoming electricians. They're becoming plumbers. They're working in construction. But that's a much easier path for young men. You can be making $80,000 a year if you want to go into construction right out of high school. That's a harder path for young women. So this is not to like at all negate anything that you're saying. I'm on board with everything you're saying. I just want you to kind of, have you thought about this, and does your book deal with this? And do you kind of get into some of this differentiation when we're talking about worker, you know, because it's not a gender neutral worker in a gender segregated labor market, really. Like those service industry jobs and the people who are caring for our parents and the nurses, those are all women, and the auto workers, those are men, right? So that I'm wondering if you've thought about that and how that plays into your argument.
I mean, I've thought about it, and you're absolutely right. Some of the sectors that I mentioned, some of the ones that are very, you know, numerous, home health care comes to mind, are dominated by women for sure. I don't address it directly in the book, but it certainly it creates additional challenges for workers in those sectors that are largely non-unionized, right? And yet the jobs are numerous, just numerous jobs. You know, I think that you know, I've tended to look at just sort of aggregate numbers of different types of jobs over time, not so much men versus women, but certainly the patterns you point out are important, right? And you know, I mean, we're seeing in, you know, retail workers, other places, there's obviously a movement, you know, happening now to unionize a number of establishments, and we see the pushback that you know, corporations just not going to have anything to do with it, right? They're just going to stall and stall and stall, and they have a much harder time, you know, trying to do that with an established, you know, unions like the auto workers and things like that. So I think it certainly is a factor. There's no
The
question.
Starbucks workers are the ones that are trying to, or the Amazon,
Yeah.
or whatever, right? And
Yeah,
those are much
exactly.
more, those are, I don't know the gender breakdown of those jobs, but my sense is that they're more open to everybody, right? That
I would
it's
think
not
so,
it's not a
yeah.
gender segregated.
Yeah,
Jet
yeah,
field,
I
yeah.
would think so. Although I don't, Starbucks may be, you know, perhaps disproportionately female, but I don't know. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, for sure.
I think that was a terrific question to end on. Let's give Dr. Neil Kraus another round of applause here.
Thank you. Thanks.
We will be back in the spring. This is our last talk of the semester, but we will be back in 2024. Haven't totally solidified the next talk yet, but we'll get there soon. I'm sure Neil will stick around and answer any questions you might have. Come up and say hi, right? You'll do that? Yeah?
I will.
Okay.
I will.
All right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks again. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thanks.